Every file in this video is real, public, and sitting on a government website right now. Nobody reads them. Number 10. The Gateway Process. In 1983, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel wrote a report for his commanding officers about how to leave your own body. It's a real document, 29 pages. Title: Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. The Army wanted to know whether a meditation technique involving two different sound frequencies played into each ear could push a soldier's consciousness outside of time and space. The report doesn't treat this as nonsense. It works through it seriously, with diagrams, borrowing language from quantum physics and holograms to explain how a human mind might detach and travel. It concludes the technique is plausible. The document was declassified in 2003 and posted online, where it sat completely ignored for 18 years. Then, in 2021, somebody put it on Reddit, and it spread from there to TikTok. Millions of people found a genuine U.S. Army file arguing that consciousness can escape the body and assumed it was fake. It isn't, and it had a hole in it. Page 25 was simply absent from the released version. No redaction marks, no explanation. The text just stops mid-sentence and picks up on page 26. For 18 years, requests for that page went nowhere. The agency said it didn't have it. It finally surfaced in 2021. The missing page turned out to be about the nature of what the author called the absolute. Number 9. The 1st Earth Battalion. In 1979, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel wrote a manual proposing a new kind of soldier. These soldiers would carry flowers into battle. They would use ESP. They would learn to walk through walls and to stop a goat's heart just by staring at it. This was not satire. It was circulated inside the military, and it influenced a real research effort into human potential and psychic ability. Some of the ideas were reasonable meditation, stress control, better performance under pressure. Some were not. At Fort Bragg, there was a facility called the Goat Lab. It existed for legitimate medical training. Special Forces soldiers learned to treat battlefield wounds there, and the patients were goats. Then, a civilian martial arts instructor was brought in to demonstrate his abilities, and the soldiers challenged him to kill one of the goats using only his mind. He said he did it. He also admitted that his concentration slipped, and that the goat which died was not the one he had been staring at. There is no independent evidence for any of it. He later claimed he'd done the same thing to a hamster. What's strange is how much of the reasonable half survived. Mindfulness training is now standard in parts of the U.S. military. The wall walking did not catch on. The whole story stayed obscure until a journalist wrote a book about it, which became a film with George Clooney. Most people watched it thinking the premise was invented. Number 8. Project Stargate. For roughly 20 years, the U.S. government employed people to spy using their minds. The program had several names and finally settled on Stargate. Its staff sat in a building at Fort Meade and tried to describe distant places they had never visited, using only coordinates. It was called remote viewing. Real budget, real salaries, real intelligence reports passed to real agencies. Around $20 million over 2 decades. Some sessions were reported as hits. Believers still point to them. Skeptics point out that vague descriptions match a lot of places, and that nobody checked how often the misses happened. In the 1990s, the CIA commissioned an outside review. 2 experts, one sympathetic, one skeptical, examined the data. Neither could show the program had ever produced intelligence that was actually useful for a decision. Stargate was shut down in 1995. Then, in 2017, the CIA put around 90,000 pages of files online. You can read the session transcripts yourself. Barely anyone has. Number 7. Project Artichoke. In 1952, a CIA memo asked a question. The question was whether the agency could take control of a person to the point where that person would do what they were told against their own will, even when it went against their basic instinct for self-preservation. That's not a paraphrase from a conspiracy site. That's the memo. Artichoke was the program built to find out. It tested hypnosis, drugs, and sensory manipulation on human subjects, looking for a reliable way to produce an interrogation that couldn't be resisted and, in some documents, an agent who could be directed to act and then remember nothing. Most Artichoke records were destroyed in 1973 when the CIA's Technical Services Director ordered the files burned ahead of congressional hearings. What survived by accident. Some financial records were stored in the wrong building and missed the shredder. That accident is the only reason we know any of this. The programs weren't exposed. Their paperwork was just filed incorrectly. Number 6. Project Pandora. For years, the Soviets aimed a microwave beam at the American embassy in Moscow. The Americans knew. They measured it, named it the Moscow signal, and quietly started studying what it was doing to the people inside. That study was Project Pandora. It ran through the late 1960s, testing microwave exposure on animals and monitoring embassy staff for effects. Here's the part that matters. The staff weren't told. The signal was detected in 1962. The people working under it were informed in 1976. 14 years of going to work every day inside a building. Their own government was quietly studying as a live experiment. A Senate review later stated plainly that those employees should have been told immediately. 2 ambassadors who served during those years died of cancer. A third developed a serious blood disorder and later died of leukemia. The official medical study found no proven link. A reanalysis decades later found the embassy's cancer mortality was higher than expected. Nobody has settled it. And when American diplomats began reporting strange symptoms in the 2010s, investigators went straight back to the Pandora files. Number 5. The hospital that paid in heroin. There was a federal hospital in Kentucky where people struggling with addiction went to get clean. Courts sent some of them. Others walked in on their own, looking for help. The doctor in charge was one of the country's leading experts on addiction. He was also being funded by the CIA. The patients became test subjects. They were given LSD and other experimental drugs so researchers could measure what the substances did to a human mind, how long the effects lasted, how much it took, whether tolerance built up. One group was kept on LSD for 77 consecutive days, with the dose raised as they adjusted. The subjects were overwhelmingly black men, and they were poor, and they were in no position to say no. And there was payment. Men who volunteered were rewarded with the drug they had come to that hospital to escape. Congress heard about it in the 1970s. The doctor testified. He said the science had value, and that standards had been different then. He kept his position and his reputation. Number 4. The man who fell from the hotel window. In 1953, a group of government scientists went to a retreat in the woods. One evening, the CIA's chief chemist put LSD in their drinks without telling them. One of them was an army biochemist named Frank Olson. Olson didn't recover. He became withdrawn and severely distressed over the following days. 9 days later, he went through the window of a 10th-floor hotel room in New York. His family was told he'd had a breakdown. That was the official story for 22 years. Then, in 1975, a government commission investigating the CIA published the truth about the dosing. The family found out from a newspaper. The president invited them to the White House and apologized. Congress paid them a settlement, but the family never accepted the explanation. In 1994, they had the body exhumed. The forensic scientist who examined it reported evidence of an injury to the head that he did not believe came from the fall, and called the findings strongly suggestive of homicide. A Manhattan prosecutor opened an investigation. It closed without charges. The case remains formally unresolved. Number 3. The letter the FBI sent to Martin Luther King. For 15 years, the FBI ran a program to destroy people psychologically, not arrest them, break them. It was called COINTELPRO, and the targets were activists, civil rights leaders, and ordinary political organizers. The methods were psychological warfare, forged letters, planted rumors, fake documents designed to make allies suspect each other, anonymous notes sent to spouses. The most notorious example was a letter mailed to Martin Luther King in 1964, along with a tape. It was written to look like it came from a disillusioned black supporter. It told him he was a fraud, that he was finished, and that there was only one thing left for him to do, and gave him a deadline. The FBI wrote it. King understood immediately what it was and what he was being pushed toward. Nobody would have known any of it if not for 8 ordinary people who broke into a small FBI office in Pennsylvania in 1971, took every file, and mailed them to journalists. They were never caught. They came forward voluntarily, decades later, after the statute of limitations had run out. Number 2. The Harvard Experiment. Between 1959 and 1962, a Harvard psychologist ran a study on undergraduate volunteers that he described in his own notes as vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive. The design worked like this. Each student spent weeks writing out his deepest beliefs and his philosophy of life. He was told he'd debate them with another student. Instead, he was strapped to a chair, wired to electrodes, put under bright lights, and confronted by a lawyer who had studied everything he'd written specifically in order to tear it apart. Cameras recorded his face. Then the recordings were played back to him, repeatedly, so he could watch himself being humiliated. 22 students went through it. Their real names were replaced with code names in the files. One of them was a maths prodigy who had arrived at Harvard at the age of 16. He was 17 when the study began. His code name was Lawful. His name was Ted Kaczynski. He went on to become the Unabomber and spent 17 years mailing bombs to academics and executives. Researchers still argue about how much this explains. He himself said the experiment wasn't the cause. He also said it was the worst experience of his life. Number 1. Subproject 68. A patient walks into a psychiatric hospital in Montreal in the late 1950s with anxiety or postpartum depression or a problem with her marriage. Something ordinary, something treatable. The hospital's director was one of the most respected psychiatrists alive. He had led the American Psychiatric Association. He'd assessed a Nazi official at Nuremberg. He believed a broken mind should be erased and rebuilt from nothing. Patients were kept in drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time. They were given electroconvulsive treatment at many times the standard intensity, repeatedly, until memory and personality were gone. Then came the part he called psychic driving, a recorded phrase, played on a loop, for days, hundreds of thousands of repetitions. They didn't get rebuilt. Many came out, unable to recognize their own children, or unable to hold a job again. The funding came from the CIA through a front foundation, filed as Subproject 68 of MKUltra. None of them consented. Most never found out. Compensation came decades later, to a fraction of the victims, and some families are still fighting for it now. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.